Good evening. I'm Roberta Skofsma, the Director of Bridwell Library, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Elizabeth Perkins Prothero Hall at the Perkins School of Theology on the Southern Methodist University campus. This evening we have the privilege of hearing a lecture by Professor Carla Suarez, the Director of the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. So that we may all enjoy tonight's lecture to its fullest, I would invite you at this time to reach into your pockets and check your cell phones and other electronic devices to be sure they're turned off or in a silent mode. This evening's lecture is co-sponsored by Bridwell Library, DeGaulier Library, and the Friends of Southern Methodist University Libraries. I would like to take a moment to recognize and thank those persons who have participated in the planning of this event. The Friends of the Southern Methodist University Libraries in Colophon, under the oversight of Gillian McCombs, Dean and Director of the Central University Libraries. The President of the Friends is Pamela Anderson. The Director is Amy Carver, and the Coordinator is Cindy Rupi. The Director of DeGaulier Library, Russell Martin. Our technology expert from Perkins School of Theology, Dwayne Harbin. And finally, 3 Bridwell Library staff members who spent many hours working on the details of tonight's event: Tessa Foreman, Jim McMillan, and John Speck. I now turn the podium over to my colleague, Dean Gillian McCombs, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Roberta. It's wonderful to have you here tonight. You are in for a treat, I can tell you. It's truly an honor for me to be introducing tonight's speaker, Father Carla Suarez, at this semester's first major triple or quadruple sponsored SMU Libraries program. And I think you will agree with me by the time the evening is over that Father Suarez epitomizes the librarian scholar. He's a rare combination of erudition, humor, and self-deprecating wit. Father Suarez is the director of the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, as well as professor of English and honorary curator of special collections. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Rare Book School, it was founded at Columbia University in 1983 and brought to the University of Virginia in 1992. And each year, 250 to 400 students are selected to take part in the courses at the Rare Book School in Charlottesville and also in New York City, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. And the students include conservators, rare book librarians, academics, antiquarians, bookbinders, collectors, you name it. About 6,000 students from 25 countries have taken courses since the school's founding, including several on the staff of the SMU Libraries. Raise your hand if you have been through Rare Book School. Wonderful. Father Suarez is the holder of research fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment of the Humanities, the Radcliffe Institute for the Advanced Study at Harvard University, and the Folger Library. He holds 4 master's degrees, 2 in English and 2 in theology, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford. He's managed to figure out how to have the best of both worlds, as some of us might think. He spends 7 months in the UK at Oxford at Campion Hall and 5 months in the US at UVA. He's a renowned international scholar in the history of the book, of printing, of rare books in general, the book trade, and most recently the impact that digital technology is having on the way we think about and use books and the way we think generally. His most recent books include a very well-received co-edited edition of the Oxford Companion to the Book, published this year, and which you can see for yourself on the shelves in the reference section at the Bridwell Library. It is a 1,000,000-word reference book, described by the Wall Street Journal as a fount of knowledge where the internet is but a slot machine. His other works include the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, Volume 5, in 2009, Making Meaning, Printers of the Mind and Other Essays, 2002, the same year that he was the consultant editor for the Oxford Chronology of English Literature. But in addition to his contributions to the literature on rare books and printing and his pastoral duties, Father Suarez leads another life of the mind as poetry critic, editor, and poet. He was the co-general editor with Leslie Higgins of an 8-volume publication on the collected works of Gerard Manley Hopkins, which Fondren Library has, and has edited a critical edition of Robert Dodsley's A Collection of Poems by Several Hands. But to me, one of the most personal and meaningful aspects of Father Suarez's substantial contributions to the discourse on literary culture has been his poems, which manage to speak directly to one's soul, combining a deceptive simplicity, a recognition of the effect of the small acts of daily life, and the possibility for grace that might come from those moments. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to read you one of his most recent poems, which was the winner in 2008 of the Foley Poetry Prize. Its title is Going, and it begins with the epigraph, "Sometimes I think that Jesus must have been on the train." Lost property auctioneer. Who left them? And how did they walk down the long platform at Reading or at Slough? Did they abandon their trusty wheelchairs or throw down their crutches and take the stairs unaided for the first time in years, then hop into a waiting van and say, "Let's shop for dancing shoes at McMurray's on the way"? Did they arrive and hurry up the nursing home drive, shouting, "I'm out of here, pack up my stuff and buy everyone a beer on me"? Travel is a marvel, I know, but how could they up and out on their own, without braces or canes? Not noticing they walked without walkers, leaving passengers to talk of miracles or fraud. And why didn't they telephone to get their trophies and say, "I've got to explain"? And who was that nice conductor who came to my aid and helped me off the floor and said, "Walk and fall no more"? And were there any witnesses so I can be sure of this business? Mind you, I don't mean to complain, though while I'm on the line, I'll mention the train was more than 45 minutes late. It's hard to win when the world knows you'll fail. Did even one return to thank British Rail? Please join me in welcoming Father Michael Suarez.
Thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. And I do have to say, the hospitality here is extraordinary. The riches here in the collections are extraordinary. But the people here are really exceptional. And for those of you who are part of the libraries, for those of you who are benefactors, you are part of something truly great here. And even in my brief time here, I have been wonderfully impressed. I've spent most of my professional life in the Bodleian Library and in the British Library. I'm not easily impressed. I find myself wonderfully impressed, not just by the things, but by the people as well. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a wonderful day. I'm sorry that the denouement is going to be so disappointing. It was W.H. Auden who said, "A professor is someone who talks in someone else's sleep." So here we are, ladies and gentlemen. It's 7:10, and the lights have been brought down low. I shall endeavor to keep you awake. What I'd like to do today is to think with you a little bit about the digital world, about the digitization of books, what are sometimes called surrogates, or substitutional equivalence. Ladies and gentlemen, the digital world is with us, and it is not the enemy. The digital world allows us to do many things, and it would be wrong for us who love books to sequester ourselves from the digital world because it enables us, but also because we don't know how the advent of the digital is going to change the structures of knowledge, but we know that it will. We don't know how the advent of the digital is going to change the structures of the academy, but we know that it will. And we who love books, whose lives are sustained by the reading of books and by the making of books, need to have a place at the table as the academy develops over time, as institutions of knowledge develop over time. And so my aim this evening is to think through with you a little bit about this question of digital books and how they evoke problems of presence, how they evoke problems of, as it were, bibliographical knowledge. That sounds big, but I think we can make it through. So I'd like to draw on some insights from other disciplines, and I'm going to be somewhat critical of the digital environment. So as a preface, I'd like to say I use the digital environment every day. It's an indispensable part of my research. But I know that being in the digital world is different than being in the world of the physical artifact. And I have some concerns about the ways that the digital environment changes the ways that we think. So that's the prelude. Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Antony Jean Gross's Napoleon Visits the Plague House at Jaffa. This commemorates an event that took place on March 11th, 1799 in the so-called Egyptian campaign. A number of Napoleon's troops were stricken with plague. On the 11th of March, Napoleon bravely walked into the pest house, and he reached out, being much like Christ in Luke chapter 5, and touching not a leper, but touching the bubos, a Greek word that means excrescence or swelling, a word that still has some currency in the English language today. He reached out and he touched the bubonic plague swelling of the lymph gland of this soldier, thereby evoking his powers, thereby evoking the idea of the king's evil, touching out and healing, but perhaps most of all, showing his bravery to his fellow officers. Everybody with me? This painting was exhibited at the Salon de Paris in September 1804 as a kind of prelude. It is the first of the great Napoleonic history paintings, and it was shown as a kind of prelude to the coronation of Napoleon as emperor, which took place on December the 2nd in that same year. All right? This is Napoleon Visits the Plague House at Jaffa. It was painted by Antony Jean Gross. It commemorates an event that took place on March 11th, 1799. The painting was first shown in September 1804. And here we can see Napoleon in a Christ-like gesture, evoking perhaps Luke chapter 5, where Jesus touches the leper, or perhaps evoking something of the king's touch to cure the king's evil. Napoleon demonstrates his bravery by reaching out and touching the bubos, excrescence or swelling, a Greek word of the man who has bubonic plague here. This painting was exhibited at the Salon de Paris in September 1804 as a kind of prelude to Napoleon's coronation on December 2nd of that same year. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Antonin Jean Gross's Napoleon Visits the Plague House at Jaffa. It's part of the Egyptian campaign, and many of you are familiar with this painting, I believe. And as you all know, evoking Luke chapter 5, he reaches out and he touches the bubos, a Greek word meaning excrescence or swelling, of the man here who is stricken with bubonic plague, thereby showing his bravery, evoking the king's evil. This painting was exhibited in September 1804 as a kind of prelude, the first of the great Napoleonic history paintings. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a magic lantern slide of Napoleon Visits the Plague House at Jaffa by Antonin Jean Gross, commemorating an event that took place on March the 11th, 1799. You see the damage from the heat lamp. I show this to you because it was by magic lantern slides, where this was literally painted onto a sheet of glass and then shown through a very bright light projected in a large theater. I show this to you because for much of the second half of the 19th century, it was precisely by the expedient of the magic lantern that most people in the West learned about Western art history. Are you with me? Yeah? This, according to its publishers, is Antonin Jean Gross's Napoleon Visits the Plague House at London. Now, you will see that I have made a terrible ontological folly. Many of you thought to yourself, gosh, the Jesuit made an ontological folly. I have committed a solipsism, for I have said again and again, this is Gross's painting. This is a magic lantern slide, which is more true. This is Gross. This is Gross. This is Gross. They can't be. And neither is this, because obviously this is the detail of the painting. But you see already how quickly I've substituted the simulacrum. I've substituted the copy for the real thing. This isn't Napoleon Visits the Plague-Stricken in Jaffa. This is a representation of that. And in this case, because it's a detail centering on the central action and eliminating the whole fact that Napoleon's troops were quartered in a mosque, a very telling detail, this has changed the whole painting. It's changed the whole architecture of the painting, because remediation or re-representation always affects change. This is an engraving of a painting that I think you're all very familiar with. This is an etching. Engravings and etchings were, of course, how people studied art before the magic lantern, by such reproductions. And this is perhaps, in my view, the best reproduction we have seen tonight. This is a black and white photograph taken by a photographer for Life magazine in the Louvre Museum, where this painting is now, in 1901. And I think in some ways this is the best reproduction of this painting, because you know it's not the real thing. You know that it's something other than the painting itself. Because reproductions that seem to be what they are not have an inherently distorting effect. Oh golly, I forgot to mention to you, Antonin Jean Gross's painting is 16 feet high and 21.5 feet wide. It's gigantic. It's enormous. How could you know? How could you know? And if we put a little ruler at the bottom, would that tell you? How could you possibly know? So the whole question of scale, the whole question of the artifactuality of the painting, the impesto, the building up of paint that is characteristic of aspects of Gross's technique, is completely invisible to us, whereas other aspects of the painting are brought into larger relief, as it were. I've brought this point up to you and perhaps belabored it because we find ourselves now in a situation where we're trying to grapple with the digital world. We're trying to say, what does it mean that our students might learn about the book by reproductions of the book for the first time in history? But the art historical community has been grappling with this question for a very, very long time. Many of you will know that Kodachrome slide film was invented in 1936 and became widely available from 1938 onwards. And in the early years of the 1940s, there is something in American art history called the color slide controversy. And the color slide controversy goes something like this. What does it mean for our students if everything they know about the history of Western painting and sculpture is mediated to them through sets of slides produced either by professors on, expedition trips or by commercial slide makers who sell sets of the Western canon of art to art history departments? Remember that course that maybe you took and maybe you didn't, called Art in the Dark? Right? There was physics for poets, there was kitty chem, there was baby bio, there was rocks for jocks, and there was art in the dark. Art History 101. Well, people were grappling with that from the 1940s, really, and they came up in the literature. I'll save you the trouble of reading it. They said, well, gosh, when art history becomes merely the study of photographs, we have a kind of reductive approach because the reproduction becomes the primary thing. It's what people know. If you've never been in the museum and grappled with the physical artifact, all you know is the picture of the picture. And that assumes a kind of false primacy. It changes the way we see, because even though you can acknowledge the distortions, think of the distortion of scale that we just saw, think about the distortions of color that we just saw. If you hadn't looked at multiple reproductions, how would you know that they were distortions? Oh, the importance of multiple copies, perhaps. We'll come back to that. And we have a loss of physical presence, because these are not artifacts. These are merely ghostly presences emanating from a Kodak carousel. So this loss of presence, it seems to me, is pretty important. But we don't have to worry about this because we're interested in the world of books. And we're assured by the commercial suppliers like ProQuest that something like Early English Books Online, it presents images that show the works exactly as they appeared in their original editions. So we don't need to worry. What's that Jesuit on about? We've been assured by the manufacturer, as it were. Here is a photograph taken in the Huntington Library in California. It's of a royal proclamation. And you can see it's printed in a very nice black letter font here. And when we see the date 1596, very legible, everything's okay, right? This is taken independently of any digital surrogate, although it is itself a digital representation. This is how it appears in ProQuest in Early English Books Online. 1596 has become 2596, turning the royal proclamation into a work of science fiction. This is astonishing to me. It's astonishing to me, the remediation, just like the remediation of those paintings turned it yellow, right? Or turned it dark, or made the detail substitute for the whole so that you thought that the painting was really only this one moment and not seeing everything around, which in fact was the whole rest of the painting is an evocation of a very important French history painting from the previous generation. That's all lost when the painting only becomes the detail. But how could you know what was lost if you didn't already know the history of the painting? How could you know? And if you didn't know, you'd be blissfully ignorant and just go on doing what you're doing without ever knowing there was any kind of problem. And your whole way of seeing would be transformed, but unwittingly for you. So here's the Hereford Bravery, a very important, albeit extremely bibliographically complicated book. And this is from early English books online, too. And one of the things that I find most ironic and curious about this delivery of these texts, which give us access to hundreds and hundreds of books, thousands of books, but I kind of want to ask myself, access to what? Because, for instance, in this breviary, the part of the text which was meant to jump off the page, the part that is rubricated, is now largely illegible. That which was supposed to be the most prominent because of the photographic processes used here has become the least prominent. In a very distorting inversion, it seems to me. And again, if you didn't know, because you hadn't ever spent time with the Hereford Bravery, how would you know that this represented rubrication? You might think that this just represented bad inking. But it's not bad inking. The ink balls were doing just fine. Thank you very much. It's the fact that this is a double impression and the first one in red. So, I don't find myself often agreeing with Google Books. But when asked in court how, according to contemporary copyright law, Google could have license to digitize all these books, even those that are in copyright, they evoked the Google defense. The Google defense is not a 4-3. The Google defense, not many football fans out there, huh? Come on, you're at SMU. Work with the program here. Google's experts testified that digitizing books transformed them into something else, and that they weren't books anymore. They were something that never existed when contemporary copyright legislation had been written. And therefore, these new things, which have no thinginess because they only exist in a digital world, they have no artifactuality, if you will, this new entity couldn't possibly be governed by the dictates of intellectual property because they were no longer books. That's pretty interesting when Google says that in court on the record. So I'm a little confused because I'm interested in history. I'm a literary historian and a book historian. I'm passionate about 17th and 18th century poetry, for example. And then I find that in 1998, an historian of the photograph was talking about the programs in cultural institutions to digitize photographs and said, oh my God, if anybody had ever done this to documents, people would have, marched in the streets. Well, I have done it to documents, and nobody marched in the streets. They just applauded. And I'm glad to have early English books online. I'm glad to have digitized maps. I'm glad to have 18th century collections online, and so on. I use them. But I'm worried. I'm worried about what they do to me as a scholar, as, dare I say, a humanist, And I'm worried about what they are doing now to the students to whom I try to pass on the wisdom of the ages, to the students to whose education I have dedicated my life's work. So it seems to me that the physical book, this is, of course, Christ as master of the world, carrying the book of life and death, the book of the laws of the universe, the book that he is the author of. And it seems to me that if we think of a book as an icon, as a kind of multidimensional, intentional object that's meant to have a presence, a book like an icon is, in the words of the anthropologists, a kind of extended human presence. It's a way of taking a presence of multiple human beings and putting them out through history. W.H. Auden, whom I quoted earlier about falling asleep, he once said something incredibly beautiful. Auden said he thought that philology was the most humanistic of all the disciplines because when studied closely enough, every word becomes a little lyric about itself. That's pretty wonderful. Every word becomes a little lyric about itself. But with the greatest respect, I think Mr. Auden was wrong. I think that actually bibliography and book history have a powerful claim to be the most humanistic of all the humanities. Because perforce, to study the history of the book means to recover the decisions and the lives of broad and varied communities of type founders and of leather tanners, of compositors who are setting type, and of paper makers, of lofty patrons and of lowly authors. It seems to me that if we know how to read a book in all its pluriformity, if we know how to read not just the linguistic codes, but the bibliographical and social codes as well, we can see that every book is alive with the judgments of its makers. And by recovering those judgments, to understand the book as a kind of totalizing, intentional, signifying system, a book that tells you what it is and how it's meant to be used, it seems to me that by recovering the decisions of those communities of makers, we pay homage to them. We have that kind of Gadamerian, if you will, fusion of horizons, where the past and the present come together in the study of history. And that seems to me to be a profoundly humanistic enterprise. So when the anthropologists talk about a book as a kind of extended or distributed person, I would want to extend that and say, actually, the book is an extended community of persons, because authors don't write books, as Roger Stoddard at Harvard famously said. Authors produce manuscripts that then communities of laborers turn into books, which is true. So I'm worried that in the digital world we have not icons, but ostracons. That is to say, not icons, something that signifies more than it is, but ostracons, that is to say, fragments with writing on them, that always make you wonder, if you're knowledgeable enough, what's missing? This is fragmented. What was this? What's missing, and how could I get access to it? And could I ever recover what's not here? I see what is here, but when I read a digital book, am I not always reading in an horizon of absence? When I take those leaves that have a contiguity in the gatherings, when I take those choirs that, as it were, have pages that sing to each other, and I pull them apart in the digital image and access them via a word search? Have I not fragmented the world of learning? Have I not produced a set of absences to which I can never get adequate access because the physicality, the artifactuality of the book is never really present? So, you'd think that students would all rush to the library because they can get this plentitude of meaning from the book. But Dr. Jason McElliott at Trinity College Dublin says, well, most of our students prefer using EBO. This is at Trinity College Dublin, one of the great libraries in the world. But even the best of them have great difficulty relating what they see on their screens to anything like the historical, physical object. The great bookman Graham Pollard said, you know nothing about books until you've looked at 5,000 real books. And he didn't mean penguins. But what if our students haven't spent time with real books? And the main way that they know books is by sitting at their kitchen tables accessing digital books. What a wonderful convenience. What a wonderful way to get research done. And yet I keep asking myself, I wonder if in the midst of all that wonderment and wonderfulness, if we're not failing to ask ourselves the question, are we controlling the technology, or is the technology controlling us? Or, as Mr. Thomas Stearns Eliot said in Choruses from the Rock, which you've all read, no doubt, as T.S. Eliot said many, many years before the advent of the computer, way before the Second World War, Eliot asked the question, where is the knowledge that we have lost in information? Where is the knowledge that we have lost in information? And I wonder if the world of the digital book isn't about information surplus and a paucity of knowledge. And as a professor and as a humanist, that makes me nervous. So it seems to me that if we want to understand a book and what it is, we have to understand a book as being comprised of three types of codes. We might say that a book is an integrated sign system comprised of bibliographical codes and of linguistic codes and of social codes. Now you say, what's he on about? Well, you know, if you go to the airport and you see that rack of books, and it's a certain size, maybe a white cover with raised foil metal letters, and there's a big grenade on it or an AK-47, you know what that book is. You know, and if it's a certain kind of book, it's kind of thin, and there's a woman who maybe is slightly falling out of her gown, and she's in the arms of a big, strong man, and the plantation is burning in the background. You know what that book is. And if you go into a different kind of bookstore and you see a book on the shelf and you only see its spine, and it's kind of that, it's a beautiful crimson book cloth. And it has gold letters on the spine. And at the bottom, it just has a single word. And it says, Veritas. You know what that book is. It's a Harvard University Press, probably scholarly edition. Right? It's that 5 feet of knowledge that every educated person must have, perhaps. Right? You know how to read this complex, this interaction of the bibliographical codes and the linguistic codes and the social codes. And so bibliography, not lists of books, but the study of books as physical objects, is a kind of literacy. It's about how to read, how to understand how the book is making its meanings. And the book is always a complex interaction between materialities and meanings. And meanings are never made in the literary world without materiality. There's no such thing as Robinson Crusoe without the instantiations of Robinson Crusoe. There's no idea that is Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe exists in a series of books. Take away all those books, there's no Crusoe. Materiality and meaning are always inextricably linked. At least until now, when materiality is taken away. And the surplus of meaning that comes from engaging with the complex sign system of the physical object is replaced by the digital object, in which the linguistic codes, the information, as it were, of a certain sort, assumes a disproportionate prominence. The bibliographical codes are marginalized, and perhaps the social codes disappear entirely. Perhaps reading a digital book is reading against a horizon of absence and of fragmentation, so that Juan Grie's depiction of the book might be most relevant for us. Now, I believe that one can pretty much, if you know enough, make an act of the mind, of the creative intelligence. If you've seen your 5,000 books, you can look at any digital simulacrum and reconstruct what's missing, probably. But what redress would there be for someone encountering the digital book for whom this was his or her primary way of understanding the past? So here we have William Davenant's Temple of Love. This ruler will tell you exactly how big the book is, of course. And this is a book from 1634. It's a Caroline mask, and we can see here just a little bibliography. Here is signature B3. Here's the catchword 2. No problem, right? Everybody's with me. Let's turn the page, shall we? Oh my goodness, we've gone to signature C2. B3 verso and C1 recto are missing. Our 2 has become, ironically, from. The catchword 2 all of a sudden matches up to the first word, from. This book could not exist in physical reality. You can't have a recto without the verso. You can't do it, right? I mean, if you can, you're going to make a lot of money. I don't know how you do it, but, right? Okay, so that's okay, though. You know, somebody missed something. It's all right. So we go to C2 here. And we turn the page. And we say, oh, wait a minute. This is C3 verso and C4 recto. So this is C4. So C2 verso and C3 recto are entirely missing. So again, this opening is impossible. It can't exist. Physically, it can't exist. It can only exist in the false world of digitization. Now, remember Jason McElliott's comment at Trinity College Dublin when he said, my students can have great difficulty relating what they see on the screen to anything like the historical physical object. That's a problem. So again, to recap very briefly, digitization is good. It's here and it helps. But at what price and what redress could there be? So I turn to medicine, just as I looked at art history and the history of photography. Now I look to medicine, and I see that in the medical world, they've been using MRIs and CAT scans and PET scans to teach anatomy for many, many years, and I think that's great. But what a number of physicians have discovered is that when they're teaching, say, pathology, as this chap is, Dr. Jeffrey T. Joseph, he discovered that his residents had never experienced the gross pathology of the brain, even though they were residents in neuropathology. and he started to make them do autopsies of brains. I'm sorry, thank God you haven't had your dinner yet. But one of his physicians said it's like the difference between looking at a map of a place and driving around in that place. The digital image is just a map. That's very interesting, it seems to me, because that attention to the physical reality and the relationship between form and meaning, or as I was taught as a biologist, between structure and function, is not so different from the books that we're talking about. Lest you think that that's just one example, this is from the New York Times from 2 weeks ago. And this physician is at Stanford, and he's teaching students how to do the physical, because he found that the students were all in the room where the computer screens were, looking at the images of their patients, and spent less and less and less time with the physical patients themselves. So now there's something called the Stanford 25. Look it up online. Make sure your doctor does it. Because it's about the 25 points that should take place in a real physical exam. And Stanford University Medical School is saying, we've almost lost the art. We have to go back to the old physicians, or the physicians, in this case, from other countries, and learn how to do the physical exam. This is not very different from learning how to do physical bibliography. We can't just look at the images. We have to get out of the room where the computer is and go to the bedside, or in this case, the desk, with the book on it, and learn how to do the physical exam. So Questia.com, which is another one of these things, says, you're going to read a real book. It's just like the original physical book. You can interact with this book just as you would with a physical book. Wow. Okay. You see, in medicine now they're beginning to say it's not the same. In art history they've been saying it's not the same. But in the world of books, everybody's saying it's just the same. It's just the same. And I think it's not. It's good. It's salutary. It does a lot of great stuff for us. But, catechetical figure coming, it ain't the same. Okay? It's not the same. So we get into this funny world where the British Library is mediating to us virtual books with this, turning the pages trademark thing. Here's the Lindisfarne Gospel, and you turn the corner, whoa, there goes the page. So you can pretend that it's not, you can pretend that you've got a book. Well, you don't have a book. And I'm a little worried that with a Kindle, which I have one, and I'm worried that with the Kindle it pretends to be a book. And I think just like the black and white photograph is the best representation of that painting, because you know what is not, and you know what it is. I think that this is the wrong way to go, because I think that this makes people think it's just like a book. It's not just like a book. Am I delighted to see the carpet pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels? I love this book. When I was a student and I used to go to the manuscripts room of the British Library, and this book was standing 7 feet from the entrance to the manuscript room, and I would have to pass by this book every day, I would stop and pray before this book. Pray that I might have the wisdom of the maker of this book, that the Word of God might live in me as the Word of God came alive in the artistry of this book. This book is a holy relic of the history of Christianity. But the digital image is a great way to have access to it. But it's not a book. And we shouldn't pretend it's a book, because if we do, we lose the insights of art history, which says the picture's not the painting. The CAT scan is not the patient, and this is not a book. So here's what I'm worried about. And librarians, I'm going to apologize to you right from the start. This is the Ithaca Group's 2009 report to the research libraries, like this place, in America. And I'm a bibliographer, and I find that on page 12, if you want to go look at it online, on page 12, this is what the Ithaca report says about me, and about, Dan, and about Eric, and about a bunch of people who are in this room who are bibliographers and book historians. And this is what it says. It says, idiosyncratic scholars, hi, nice to meet you. Idiosyncratic scholars may have interest in arcane features of text-based materials that are insufficiently captured by digitization, but such needs are edge cases and are correspondingly hard to predict. Hello. I don't know if you ever met an edge case before, but I am he. This makes me nervous. This is something called what to withdraw. And it says, digitize the stuff and take it off the shelves and keep it around off-site for 30 years. And the generation of professors who care about the physical stuff, they'll die. I'm 50. In 30 years, well, I better hang on a second. Okay. All right. Well, so, how long can I live? Well, will my students stand outside the provost's office when the stuff gets to start put in dumpsters? Because we've got digital copies of it, right? So why would we need the physical copy? We got the digital stuff. And, we can use that for remote learning all over the place. And we don't have to worry about it being withdrawn or anything. So this is the future, right? Well, I worry about the keyword search because the purpose of the digital book is really the keyword search as much as anything else. So now I want to ask you guys a couple of questions, all right? Don't raise your hands because this is embarrassing. All right, this is very embarrassing. I shouldn't be asking this at a good Methodist school, but I'm going to. How many of you ever read Fanny Hill? Fanny Hill is an 18th century salacious novel. It sold thousands and thousands of copies. It was the subject of a bunch of court cases. Now, it was banned. Absolutely. It was banned multiple times. Although, interestingly, the author said there's not a single dirty word or a mention of a particular part of human anatomy in this book. He wrote it very, very cleverly. So now I want to ask you, what would you put into a keyword search to retrieve the salacious content of Fanny Hill? See, if you had read the book several times and laughed because it actually is funny, it's not meant to be funny, but it is. If you had read the book multiple times, you would know that actually the word that you'd want to put in there, the most racy word in the book, is the word engine. Okay? Believe it or not, engine. Okay? Which is the kind of euphemism that's used repeatedly. Anybody ever read the novel Tom Jones? Yeah? Pretty funny book, right? So what would you put into a keyword search to retrieve Tom Jones's learned humor where he's employing Lucan extensively and kind of transmorphing in some way the Horatian sermo? What would you put in to recover the kind of classical learning as an agent of humor in Tom Jones? Well, if you had read the book enough, you might know what to put in, but you'd have to have read the book multiple times, wouldn't you? And that's not what the keyword search is about, is it? No. So, like anything else, the answers are only as good as the questions you ask. But how would you know how to ask good questions unless you had spent a lot of time not being a user, but being a reader? Right? Are books for using or are books for reading? If you're a humanist, I worry that what we're doing by the keyword search is we're turning material objects into ethereal subjects, so that this great library of the Western corpus of literature exists so that I can punch in the word servant and I can get all these kind of adumbrated examples highlighted in red of the word servant in this whole canon of literature. And by collecting them, I have something, right? Right? Don't I? Don't I have a doctoral dissertation on ideas of the servant? Isn't that great? And what books have I read? A few secondary works on servants and servitude, perhaps. But what do I know about literature? What's happened to me as a humanist? Are these books haven't they become less about the pleasure principle than about the puzzle principle? Does literature become something to be solved? The great desideratum of these search engines and indeed of the digital world is velocity of access. Call me crazy, but I spent 12 years studying to be a Jesuit priest before my ordination, and then I spent another 5 doing my doctorate. I was a student post-BA for 17 years. I'm a little slow. Move my lips a lot when I read. And I was taught that the essence of the humanities is sustained engagement. I was taught that we spend time with works that are true and good and beautiful in order that our lives themselves might become a little bit more good and true. And dare I say, beautiful. And I don't know what that has to do with velocity of access. So a cognitive scientist, Marianne Wolf, talks about the difference that happens in the human brain between deep readers and decoders of information. And when you engage in that deep reading, you actually create more synaptic connections. But when you're doing decoding of information, you begin to even fragment the structures in your brain. That troubles me. So when we digitize these books, what happens is we go to the British Library and we just pick the copy in the British Library. We don't do any research about which is the best copy, but we also have one copy. And if it's not in the British Library, we go to the Bodleian Library and we take that one and we digitize it. If not there, we go to Cambridge. And we go to Cambridge University Library and we digitize that one. And so on down the line. And there's just a kind of hierarchy of what it is. We don't worry about studying the variants of the book and figuring out what the best copy of the book is. But then when we digitize it, there's one copy. And that becomes the copy, right? And that's the copy that everybody around the world is using. Now, contrast that with Walter Rothschild, who in his time as a naturalist collected 2,225,000 butterflies, to say nothing of the 30,000 beetles, the 300,000 bird skins, and so on. And Rothschild, when he was asked why he did this, he said, I have no duplicates in my collection because in nature there is no such thing as a duplicate. No two organisms are identical. I have no duplicates, he explained. Well, it seems to me, particularly in the hand-press period, if you know enough about the physical object, we need to treat printed books much more as witnesses rather than sources. We need to say not that this is a source for my mining, for my data mining, but rather this is a witness the way medievalists think about manuscripts as a witness, because there are no duplicates on the SMU campus. There are no duplicates in your collection, because ultimately there cannot be any such thing as a bibliographical duplicate. Here's an extreme case. This is Swift's Verses on the Death of Dr. Swift, published in 1739, a poem that I love, published in 4 different states, each one with a different set of footnotes. No one set of footnotes entirely complete. But if you look at 18th century collections online, there's one copy. How would you know what was missing unless you had looked at multiple physical copies and compared them? But But you can't do that comparative work, which is so essential to humanistic inquiry if you're relying primarily on the digital copy. So I find it troubling that Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon.com, who made all his money selling books before he ever got into the world of the Kindle, said that the best thing about a book is that it disappears while you're reading. Well, that's a very different view of the book than the view that I'm trying to suggest to you, which is that the physical book is part of making meaning, that there's no such thing as the book without its physical instantiation. Roger Chartier wanted to know who is Molière and how did he become the national playwright. And so he looked at every edition of Molière from the very beginning right up through the 20th century. And he watched him become more and more important. He watched him become canonical. He watched him become the national playwright. He watched him be mediated for school children. He watched him be exported to the rest of Europe and to America. And he said, by understanding the history of these editions, I understand who Molière became for each of the makers of these books, because the making of each book incarnates a theory of the author and his works. But Mr. Bezos tells us that the book just disappears when you read it. I'm also very worried about the fact that I don't know that the digital world is here to stay. The digital world is still an experimental world. I hope it is here to stay. But Jerome McGann, who wrote a very important work on the question of sustainability, said that if he was advising a young woman who was in the academic profession and who wanted to get her dissertation out there so it would be read 100 years from now, and she had the choice of getting $10 million from the Mellon Foundation or publishing her book in 300 copies from a small press. Yes, he said, if she wants her book to be read 100 years from now, the 300 copies is the best choice. That's scary, it seems to me. We don't know that this is a sustainable technology. So we joke about it because we have anxiety about it, and that's not a bad thing to make jokes. But it seems to me that there are cases that already tell us what the problems are. This is the famous BBC project of the Second Doomsday Book. And the Second Doomsday Book, the data was collected and the book was made between... The Laserdisc was made between 1984 and 1986. By 2002, it was unreadable. And a special project between the University of Leicester and the University of Michigan, to the tune of 6 figures, got together to recover the data off the disks and make it readable in a machine. Oh, we've come so much further since then. Perhaps. Here's the Doomsday Book. I can read it. I don't need to spend $100,000 or pounds to read it, because it's still there just the way it was. Is the digital technology sustainable? I ardently hope it is, but I have my doubts. So we get Steve Marching in the Wall Street Journal talking about the trans book, the book that contains all book. It wants to be all things. We'll just have the whole library digitally. We'll know everything right on our iPads. This is the dream of the future. It seems to me a dangerous dream. Because perhaps to want to know everything is, in the end, to know nothing. So what is the digital book? In the end, it seems to me it's a simulacrum. And if we look at the etymology of the word to simulate, we see that a simulacrum is a representation of what is absent. And so the problem of presence, ladies and gentlemen, seems to me the main problem in the digital world. Because we read in a horizon of absence. Because the plenitude, the signifying potential of the artifact, the community of makers that's meant to be present to us in the humanistic enterprise of reading the book in its multiple codes, becomes vitiated, if not wholly absent. And so my fear, ladies and gentlemen, is that the advent of the digital world, for all its salutary effects, also imperils the future of the humanities to some degree, because it changes the way we see, because it changes the ways that we understand, because in valuing velocity of access, in privileging the keyword search, in understanding that the task of the humanities is the accumulation of information rather than the slow accretion of knowledge and, dare I say, wisdom, I think we may be in trouble in future generations. I fear that unless we understand what the technologies do to us, they will transform us rather than us transforming them. And as much as I love the digital environment, as much as I am, ladies and gentlemen, the editor-in-chief of the largest digital humanities project in the world, a multi-million pound project undertaken by Oxford University Press to digitize the whole corpus of scholarly editions, with full markup and full metadata. I worry that unless we get it right, we imperil the future of the humanities even as we seek to advance it. For it seems to me that we're forced to conclude that a digital book is no book at all. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to take questions. Sir.
Yes, I happen to be one of those computer scientists, but I look at it in a different way. I've struggled from when I learned 50 years ago, fortran and only capital letters. And I've considered, what is output? Where are we going? To me, I would like to see output go all the way to be an installation. We're close with multimedia, but how do we communicate the result of all of the computations that are going on? Because the idea is to communicate something to someone else. And in some sense, I see it in poetry and art. And the word installation somehow comes to my mind. So what do you see as a general medium? I'm not limiting books or anything, but how do you communicate with someone a full experience?
Sure.
You're a poet, so that...
It's a great question. I'll just repeat it so that everybody can hear, maybe the people who are behind you in the corner. The question is, in the modern world, there's such a, I mean, forgive me if I paraphrase in a way that skews your, I don't mean to. There's such a plentitude of information and of good things out there, and how could we mediate it in a way that's comprehensible? And perhaps something of the idea of something more performative or something that's more like an installation might be the way forward. I couldn't agree more in many ways. I want to preserve what we have from the past, but I want to find ways to go forward. I'm teaching a class to freshmen next semester on the history of the book. We're going to look at the Archimedes Codex and the first folio of Shakespeare. We're going to look at Paine's Rights of Man, all the way through. But the last thing we're going to look at is a book that's been made for the iPad. And it's this Beggar Woman book. Does people know this? It's the best-selling book on the iPad, The Beggar Woman of Something Cross. It's a book that's written and designed by a filmmaker. And the book is partly words on the page and partly kind of live interactive film for the child to engage with. And I think this is marvelous. Again, the digital's not the enemy. We gain nothing by being Luddites. We don't want to draw a line in the sand and say this far but no further. This is a wonderful thing for a child. This is a wonderful thing that will help tens of thousands, if not millions of children learn to love reading. My fear is that it does a lot of the work for the child. And even as television was criticized for doing more work for the viewer than radio did for the listener, I'm a bit worried about how much work is done. Graham Greene, when he was talking about his novels being made into film, he said, no, she's a very beautiful woman. And you've made her this beautiful woman. But I've written this character so that she is every beautiful woman. I've written this character very carefully so that she is the beautiful woman for every woman and every man who reads this book. And now she's this actress with these lines. And he said the limitation of that, because it's not happening in the imagination, he thought was a privation. And so I think that we're always living in a world of, if I may use a phrase that Newman used a lot, loss and gain. And I think that there's a lot to be gained, but I also think we're in a world of loss. And I think that almost any remediation scheme that one can think of right now entails both of those things. I don't think the humanities are dead. I think that the digital environment, one of its salutary effects is that it's made us much more conscious of the physicality of the book and kind of occasioned a renaissance in looking at the physical book and appreciating the features of the book. And I, of course, as a bibliographer and book historian, welcome that. But the way forward is complex and multifarious, and this is certainly one of those ways. And I'm going to have to do my push-ups and go for a run tomorrow morning because I want to be around to see what happens. Sir, you had your hand up.
Yes, I think you started to answer my question because your presentation emphasized the commercial reproductions of books, Google Books, and others. But you also have projects like the Armando Lapro's project, got the Blake Archive, got the Walt Whitman Archive, which are trying to reproduce the original text, comparative examples. You can see what different editions look like, different issues look like. So, do these fall outside of your major concerns, or are they still? I mean, they're not important to the books themselves.
Quite so. Again, I think this is a classic example. The question is, I've mostly focused on some of the commercial providers. What about Joe Viscomi and co. at the Blake Archive, who went around the world and took, hyper color-corrected photos of all the surviving Blake books and put them in a very sensitive environment with Erdman's scholarly addition to accompany and all the rest. This is a marvelous humanistic enterprise, it seems to me. What about the Walt Whitman archive, which gives the reader access to all the editions of Leaves of Grass in its permutations published in Whitman's lifetime? This is an astonishing thing, and slightly beyond. This is an astonishingly useful thing for the teaching of literature and book history, and I embrace them. But wouldn't it be a shame if students thought, I don't need to go see The Marriage of Heaven and Hell because I've seen it online and I can blow it up and do stuff to it. I can use those amazing search tools in the Blake Archive to say, give me the Pope's Triple Tiara because I want to see where Blake uses this because I know he's been reading the book of Revelation. Boom, I've got it. I don't have to read Blake. I've got my research project. 2 triple tiaras, one in the book of, one in America, a prophecy, and one in Europe, a prophecy. So this is allied to prophecy against Rome and so on and so forth. And boom, there's my term paper. Right? I don't have to go in the library. This is great. You see, so that the simulacrum becomes the thing itself because you could do so many great things with it. I will tell you, another one of those books that I felt very small before. Was when I went to the Yale Center of British Art, and Mr. Mellon was still alive, and I spent time, about 4 hours, just looking at Paul Mellon's unique copy in the world of Jerusalem, and it was a very important moment in my life as a humanist, and I can be in bed in my PJs, or dare I even say in my skivvies. And I can read Blake's Jerusalem on my laptop because of the Blake Archive. But it ain't the same. So while it's a great development, and I welcome it, and I think it's money extremely well spent, I worry that for my students and their students and their students, that this becomes the book of Thel, that this becomes the marriage of heaven and hell. And that makes me nervous, as we say in Brooklyn. All right? Please.
I think you should be very worried about the digitization of books for children, because what we've been seeing for the last number of years when working with young children is that it flattens their sensory development. Since all the pathways are not being used, the fact is it distorts literally the development of their brains and nervous system.
Fascinating. I think people heard that because it was a kind of a clarion call. I do think that, when I was a child, I liked to chew on the books. I had a book about Peter Rabbit where you reached in and you petted Peter Rabbit and he was a little furry when you reached down the rabbit hole. I think that was probably a good thing. Anybody who's dropped a bath book, one of those vinyl bath books, into the tub, sort of the multidimensionality, the artifactuality of it is important. But I'll tell you what's also important. It's also important to be a kid coming home from college and to say, wow, I made the dean's list and I know all this stuff. And to go back into your room at Thanksgiving or spring break. I didn't go to Fort Lauderdale during spring break. And to didn't have the money. And to walk into your room and to see those kind of beat up copies of Stuart Little on your shelf and think, oh, now I can read Virgil in the original, but once upon a time, this was my universe. That's a salutary development for all of us, it seems to me.
And you can smell it, and you can stroke it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well,
all of those pathways are neglected when the young child in development is put into the electronics.
Right. And see, what I would like to have is, I'm not an either-or guy. You might not like this, but I'm not an either-or person. That's not what I'm proposing here at all. I'm proposing both and. I'm a big advocate of both and, not either-or. I think we need both. And that's, to me, that's the best way forward. There was somebody, sir.
Yeah. I like the word skepticism as part of our theme. We don't have enough skepticism about any of these new things. We don't ask the right questions. We appreciate your asking questions for us. It's been a great event. But my major was Russian language. I was taught Russian during the Korean War with actual immigrants who had been survivors of the revolution, and immediately communicated to us that what the Americans were writing for American students to study about communism and the Russian Revolution had thrown away an entire culture because it did not want to recognize that the first Trans-Siberian Railroad was built under the Tsars, not under the communists, although they have taken charge of that. So I worry about what we lose if we aren't skeptical. Is this the real copy? I mean, they say it's the real copy, but how do I know?
Right. So here's what I would say. So the questioner asked, should we have a healthy skepticism? I think that there's a kind of a philosophical stance that's not being, as it were, a Straussian, a radical philosophical skeptic on the one hand, but nor being Pollyanna on the other hand. I think there's a way of taking a via media here, which says we have to ask these questions. And we go back to, I think that we should go back to the classical Greek world and say that when the librarians were doing this amazingly humanistic enterprise of putting together the library at Alexandria, they began the discipline of bibliography by trying to ascertain which were the best copies in the world of the works that they wanted to have in the library. And that is a critical enterprise, going back to the Greek word kritikos, which literally means the one who sits in the seat of judgment. And you can't make an informed judgment unless you school yourself. And if you put yourself in the judgment seat, you have to ask difficult questions. And that requires a critical intelligence, which perforce entails a degree of healthy skepticism. And I think one reason why we haven't been as skeptical as we might be about this is because the digital world does so many good things for us. You know, I love my iTunes. The digital world does. I love doing the word search on some of these things. But if I'm also not reading the books, what redress can there be for this? I think, again, it's a both end. Use the tools, but spend lots of time with the physical objects too. It's a both and. It's a new way of being a humanist, but it does not throw out the old ways. It says we can be empowered by these new devices, which are ways of, as it were, getting information in a speedier way, but it's no substitute for that sustained engagement. It's no substitute for that humility that calls us to be transformed by our time with these books. Sir.
I think my answer to your problem is to encourage all your students to become book collectors, since libraries are having to de-access collections and so forth. If you encourage the idea of collecting books and their books particularly, that might help. But I want to pose a question about the future of book publishing to you from the point of view of a former director of the University Press. At Penn State, we had an Office of Digital Scholarly Publishing, whose co-director was a former Virginia colleague of yours, Mike Furlow. The object of that was to publish scholarly monographs, open access online, with an option for people to buy a print version. Now, this involves the question of what's called distributed publishing. It's actually up to the end user to decide what kind of printing device and everything to use. You can use espresso book machine, library, whatever. So actually, the form of publication comes down almost, and eventually it might come down to a machine in the home where a home user could actually print out a book there if they wanted a print copy. That's one problem. So there are a variety of different physical manifestations of the digital book that exist. The other is the vision that Robert Darnton has long had for what he calls a multi-layered scholarly document, that is a different kind of book that exists in the digital world that has no physical counterpart and no possible physical counterpart. He encouraged the ACL's Humanities eBook project and Gutenberg E, which tried to bring about these things. They ran into problems because they turned out to be a great deal more expensive to actually accomplish than anyone had it. Well, at least he had imagined. I was on the board of advisors that told him, you can't do this the economic way you think you can. But the point is that this is a realization of the true abilities of digital technology to do something that cannot be done in the print world. And then that poses for you the question of there can be no physical counterpart to what exists in the digital world, because that is a unique entity and can only exist digitally.
So a couple of things here, just to recap. One, a comment, a great way to teach our students the love of books would be to encourage them to be collectors. To that, I would ask a very simple question of Roberta. Put you on the spot here. Do you love my sister Kathy? No, you don't, right? And you don't know her precisely. You can't. My sister Kathy is very lovable. I'm very insulted. But you couldn't love my sister Kathy because you don't know her. And you cannot love what you do not know. This is an ancient principle. And it seems to me that loving and knowing always go together. And by encouraging young people to begin collecting books, or young people to have physical books that they can cherish and so on, that their sustained engagement then is on the shelf and comes back to them and so on, that this idea of book collecting as a way of knowing, and that the books that are collected aren't just a group of individual objects, but when brought together, have a kind of resonance among them that makes them more than the sum of their parts. This is a great way to think about that congeries of knowing and loving, which is essential to the enjoyment of almost anything. And so I would say, of course, book collecting is an extremely salutary thing and also does a great deal for future civilizations. Where would we be here if there weren't great collectors who contributed to the very institution that we're in right now? So yes, of course. Then the question becomes, what about the future of digital scholarly publishing? You'll know that Rice University just went belly up in their enterprise in this too. So the costs are greater than we thought, certainly. And yet, the questioner asked, what about Robert Darnton's idea for his great book based on a document, a physical document, where a man who's an agent for a publishing house goes from place to place. And Darnton tells this wonderful thing about how he goes from town to town to town and meets all these different agents and so on, and has to at one point get a new horse, and he writes it down in his journal for business expenses and so on. And it's about all the different people he encounters and his run-ins with the police and all this as he goes through all these different towns. And Darnton says, well, what I'm really going to do is I'm going to transcribe this. I'm going to make a 7-layered digital book that you could just read the first layer, and that's great, but you could click on a hotkey and you could learn something about a second layer, and then if you were more interested to learn about something else, you could click on another hotkey and go down, and another hotkey and go down, and I wouldn't burden the reader with all this detail right at the beginning. You'd have to follow a kind of pathway, and therefore I could be doing something, says Darnton, that you couldn't do in a print environment. Bob Darnton's smarter than just about any of us will ever be. And he's right. It's a great way to do a book. I want to do a book very like that, not exactly the same, with Alexander Pope's published correspondence. Because it came out in different instantiations, and he faked some of it, and a publisher faked some of it, and there are all these different layers, and probably there are 4 different versions of Pope's letters. A lot of self-fashioning there, a lot of rewriting history. And I think a digital book would be a great way to do that. But of course, that book is much more about information than about anything else, right? It's about a kind of acts of textual criticism. It's a research book, a different kind of thing. But yes, the world is complex, but it's also promising. It's threatening, but it's also full of possibilities. And again, I want to have a place at the table. I want us to have a place at the table because we care deeply, because we've given our lives, and in many cases a great deal of our resources, to the future of humanistic learning. And therefore it seems to me that if we prescind from these futures and merely condemn them as bad or threatening or scary, we lose our right to be part of a conversation that we can have a significant influence over. Sir.
I'm a physician. A lot of what you said about the sort of pluses and minuses of the digital world, which recently was really fascinating. I want to mention one thing, which is that my hospital recently converted to a digital medical record. And so this is going to be great because it's more efficient and it's better than keeping all that paper around. You can always find the chart. There have been a couple of negative consequences I already see. One is that the students and the residents, when they write their notes, they love, Control C, Control V. And so instead of writing an intelligent summary of what's happened over the past few days, they copy the notes from before. And so you have someone comes into the hospital with a headache and a fever, and 40 days later they still have a headache and a fever, even though all this other stuff has happened. The other is that we, as part of the lost art of the physical exam, we sometimes ask the patients to do things like draw a clock or write a sentence, and that gives you some insight into their neurologic functioning. And so recently I asked some of the students, did you have them draw a clock? And they said, well, we didn't know where to put it. There's no chart. There's no physical
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And so by going digital, on the one hand, you may become more efficient, but on the other hand, by cutting and pasting, you may have less sustained engagement. My baby brother, who's not a baby, is a physician at Johns Hopkins, was for many years at Mass General. He's a high-risk cardiac anesthesiologist and critical care physician. If you need a heart and lung transplant, or if you need an aortic arch replacement, call Tom, okay? Because he'll keep you alive while they drop it in. But he said that one of the great things about writing notes in the chart is that as you're writing, you're thinking through the problem. And when you're dictating, you're just going da-da-da-da-da, or, whatever. So the digital environment changes the way we think, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, but it certainly makes a change. So, again, the question is, what is lost and what is gained? You can't see it, but if you remember the slide about the physician revives the dying art, the physical, thanks, that's great. Thank you. Physician revives the dying art, the physical. If you follow the links in this New York Times article, you get the Stanford 25, which is really good, and so on and so forth. But then you get an article by this chap, Abraham Verghese, a beautiful essay that is very apposite here because I showed you the icon and the ostracon, the fragment. And the essay is called The Patient as Icon. When was the last time you went in for medical treatment and felt like you were an icon? So again, what can we learn from, I ask myself, what can we learn from art history, who's been there and done that with the question of the simulacrum? What can we learn from the history of photography, which lives largely in a digital environment now? What can we learn from the history of medical instruction, which is going more and more back to the autopsy and more back to the physical exam and less to the digital environment of at least the world of the scan, as it were? And boy, I'm really grateful that there's such a thing as a CAT scan. Really grateful. Hell, I'm grateful for the fact that there's an X-ray. I teach 17th century, 18th century British literature, and my students say to me often, they say, "Oh gosh, Prof, you're so into this, and you seem to know, practically what Samuel Pepys had for breakfast." I say, "Well, sure I do. It's in the diary." But then they say, well, you probably would really like to live in the age of Samuel Johnson, right? I'm like, what, are you kidding? There's no anesthesia. There's no penicillin. There's no dentistry. No thanks, No. So, but I think that, again, it's a failure of imagination in some ways. Because my students need to not just read Penguins, they need to confront the artifactuality of the time period that they're in, and then they'd see this is a whole nother world, right? All you'd have to do is maybe look at a teapot and you'd see it's a different world, much less some writing equipment. So I think that this return to the physical is part of what bibliography is all about right now. But I'd want to emphasize to you that bibliography is not, it's a big word and it's accrued a lot of scary meaning. All bibliography is a form of literacy. It's a being able to read more than the linguistic codes in the text. It's about learning how to read the paper and the type and the spaces between the lines called the leading. It's about learning how to read the binding. It's about learning how to read the format, the size of the book. Boswell said to Edmund Malone when he was finishing up the life of Johnson, he said, I'm going to publish this as a folio. And Malone said to him, well, you can, Bos, but if you do, you might as well throw the whole print run into the Thames. Because nobody reads a folio anymore. And so the book comes out in 2 volumes in large quarto and becomes a bestseller. Because the format of the book and its significance changes over time. And Malone, who was a great bookman, says, if you publish it in folio, everybody will be associating it with church fathers, opera omnia, the stuff that you read because it's good for you, the cod liver oil of books. Everybody will associate this with books of learned sermons from the 17th century, and they won't go near it. But if you publish it as a big quarto in 2 volumes, people will be able to kind of have it on their laps by the fireside. And they'll have Dr. Johnson's conversation as a companion the way you had Dr. Johnson's conversation as a companion. And so even the very format of the book, how many times the paper is folded, has a profound signifying effect about what the book is and how it makes its meanings. But in the digital world, that's largely lost to us. And you have to have handled a lot of quartos and folios and large octavos and small octavos and duodecimos to make the leap of imagination, the critical active mind, to be looking at the digital simulacrum and to reconstruct for yourself what is missing. And if you don't know what's missing, how will you ever think about what's not there? Sir.
It seems like the problem you're identifying predates digitization by decades and decades. So the volume of Chaucer, for example, Riverside Chaucer, isn't a manuscript Chaucer. So all of these aspects of the book are gone. Do you have the same sorts of representation about the Riverside edition of Chaucer? Shakespeare as to digitized version of them? I would say that I've been a college student since 1999. It's only in the last couple of years that I've really been exposed by faculty at new school to the book history and the materiality of the text. But I would hesitate to say that I missed something about the history, for example, by not getting that sooner. I certainly learned a great deal about it through cheap prints and so on. It seems to me that a lot of visual formats, as you're doing, provide these same sorts of things.
Sure.
So is a reprint of Chaucer, for example, also basing Chaucer in the same way that Google?
I think the question is, I'm a college student. I'm reading. This is the last question I'm going to take, by the way, so I'm going to set you free mercifully. But the question is, well, if I read the Riverside Chaucer in my course, that's not the Ellesmere manuscript. I'm paraphrasing, but that's not the Ellesmere manuscript sitting in Cambridge University. So isn't that some kind of privation? Isn't that something else other than Chaucer as Chaucer was mediated in Chaucer's own time? The answer is yes, and I would go farther. I would say that the Riverside Chaucer instantiates or incarnates or embodies a theory of who Chaucer is and how Chaucer is meant to be read. And it's a good thing, because it's made to help people learn Chaucer. And it has, for instance, glosses that the Ellesmere manuscript never had. It has critical aids to help you understand Chaucer, because Chaucer died in 1400, and it's a long time. The Ellesmere manuscript is not going to do that for you. But every book is a theory of the author. Every book is a mediation of the work. And we have to understand it for what it is. If you're a Chaucerian specialist, if you're writing a doctoral dissertation out of the Riverside Chaucer, and I am on your dissertation committee, you will fail. Okay? So we're talking about what kind of level here. If you're trying to get a doctorate in medieval studies from the University of York or the Pontifical Medieval Institute in Canada or Southern Methodist University, and you don't spend time engaged with manuscripts, what kind of medievalist can you call yourself? So it depends. These remediations aren't bad. They're good. They help us learn Chaucer. And most people will go no farther. And that's how I learned my Chaucer, too. But I'm not a medievalist. And if I were, it would be incumbent upon me to go look at multiple manuscripts, because that's where the next stage of meaning lies. And I worry that if we live in a digital world, we'll stop at the digital and we'll never take the next step to return to the physical book in all its plenitude of meaning. Thank you very much indeed.